Hi, I'm Nick Haig, and welcome to the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast. When companies need to inspire, engage, and develop their people, while at the same time delivering stellar results in today's hyper-competitive and complex business environment, they call on Urs Koenig. Urs is an internationally renowned keynote speaker and leading expert on humble leadership. His message of radical humility in leadership draws on his world-spanning career at UN military peacekeeper and NATO military peacekeeping commander, a highly accomplished ultra-endurance champion, a widely published professor, and a seasoned executive coach. Urs has a flair for storytelling that has inspired teams at companies like Starbucks, Amazon, and Microsoft. If you want to know how to not only be a badass leader, but also a good human, then this is the podcast for you. Welcome to the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast, Urs.
Well, thanks for having me, Nick. I love being here. It's an honor. Thank you.
It really is an honor to have you. And I think from today's conversation, that will become evident to our listeners. It's a fascinating story. Your book first came to my attention through speaking with Amy Edmondson. She said, you have to get Urs on your new podcast show to talk about his new book. So I need to thank Amy for the recommendation, because not only is it an excellent book, but Urs is a fascinating person with a great backstory to tell, from being an executive coach, widely published university professor, through to being a UN, United Nations peacekeeper. As a backcloth to our conversation today, it would be good if you can expand on my introduction to tell our listeners about the journey you've been on, how you came to write Radical Humility, be a badass leader and a good human, and also any other background information that feeds into the journey that you've been on.
Absolutely. Well, and I have to thank Amy too. I know we're both big admirers of her work. So, I have a very eclectic background. But so I was an academic, I was a collegiate level cross-country skier, ultra-endurance athlete, and as you said, executive coach. But in terms of, and then peacekeeper, but in terms of the book, I was always drawn to humble people, just naturally. In my ultra cycling career, the competitors who let their legs do the talking versus their big mouth. So I always was drawn to highly successful folks who never stopped learning and growing and get better. And then as I was executive coaching my clients, and we came out of the financial crisis and social media started to explode, I experienced a lot of my clients being always a step behind. And a lot of them were still leading very top-down command control. Yeah. And that was the first time where I really started in more seriousness look at this notion of humility in leadership. And then two things happened. I deployed, as you earlier mentioned, on 2 peacekeeping missions. I was in the Balkans for 9 months for NATO as a commander, and then I was in the Middle East for a year, 2 years ago, where apparently I did not do a very good job, seeing what's going on right now. But ironically, going back into a traditional organization, top-down command control, we often think of the military, actually showed me that the best commanders I've had were deeply humble. They had deep self-awareness. They built strong relationships with the team members, and actually deployed a growth mindset. So, and then COVID happened. And honestly, when COVID happened, a lot of us had to humbly admit that we really don't know, up to the highest office in our countries, what the future holds. And so that put, again, humility front and center for me. So when I came back from my second mission 2.5 years ago, I really, in all seriousness, dug into this humble leadership research, and and of course, the result of that quest is the book that just got published a few months ago.
Yeah. Well, it is a great book. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and we'll go through that in detail today. I think it's called Radical Humility, and then with a subtitle of being a badass leader and a good human. But my starting question for today, Urs, is what is the difference between humility and radical humility?
Well, it makes for a great book title, does it not, Nick? And I'm keenly aware there's plenty of radical, right? I mean, radical. Kim Scott, of course, published radical books as well. But in all seriousness, Radical because you can't half-ass humility. And you need to go all in, and you don't just show up because it's convenient or because you want to be nice, because there is a business need for it. And it's hard work. So it's radical because you got to go all in. You got to show up at all times. Also at home, I'm a dad of teenage boys. A lot of these principles apply to parenting as well, actually. So apply it across your whole life and do the hard work. That's why it's radical.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think there's many parallels between you and me. I too have two teenage boys at home, and so
You know,
and I could definitely see from the learnings from reading the book on how this can relate, not just from a business sense, but also into our personal lives as well. And I think when I was reading it as well, what it definitely came through to me is that this radical humility. You're not doing it just for show or to look good. It's got to be sincere. It's got to be that desire to do for yourself, for your team, and obviously wider than that, the organization, on how you're looking to take that. I loved the book, and this was very much evident. I came back from the States a couple of weeks ago, and I had to take a flight to New York, and then from there to Richmond, and I devoured it in just a couple of plane journeys. So much so, one of the fellow passengers happened to ask what the book was about, as I looked to be enjoying it so much, and wanted to know how he could become a badass leader. But after 26 years of building and running my own business, the main messages definitely resonated. I hope that if asked, my previous staff and colleagues would also say I was humble in my approach to leadership. However, there may be the cynics out there that say leaders can't be humble and confident, or even humble and ambitious, as it's often linked with this maybe being a weakness, I suppose. What would you say to those people?
Yeah, you're not an emotional doormat because you show up with humility. Now we'll talk in a second about the exact definition, but my comeback is twofold. So the first one being, you can't be humble and confident. I would argue they actually go together. Only if I'm, Nick, fundamentally confident in my own strengths and weaknesses, I have a strong sense of self, can I actually humbly invite feedback, for example, from my team members. So we all know those leaders who, cover up their insecurities with overconfidence and arrogance. And so that's the opposite. So only if I have a strong sense of self, fundamentally confident, can I ask for feedback, for example, and then hear it and act on it. So rather than being a contradiction, they actually go hand in hand. And the same goes with ambition. So what does being ambitious look like? It looks like, and I talk about this in the book, asking hard questions. Why are we not doing as well as we could, Nick? What's my part in it? And what do we need to do about it? Yeah. And so only if I'm fundamentally humble, of course, can I ask these humble questions. And then, being ambitious looks like asking these difficult questions. So again, it's not a contradiction. In order to be ambitious and ask hard questions, I need to be fundamentally humble and know that I don't have all the answers. So again, it's not a contradiction. It goes together.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, especially, this was evident at the start of your book when I was reading it, where you talk about that first day of your military peacekeeping, where you realized your subordinates knew more than you did as a commander. But in order to gain their respect, you lead by relationship rather than expertise. And it's not about, as you say, having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions, of course, but harnessing that collective wisdom from your team. And I think, that starting point, but we all need to embrace that reality that no single one person holds all the answers, do they? So
no, absolutely. But I want to actually say quickly one thing about that. Humility is no replacement for competence. If you lose your company hundreds of thousands of dollars because you don't pay attention to what's going on in the competitive landscape, all the relationship building, the self-awareness won't get you far. So, I'm always also very clear about that. So it's no replacement for competence.
Yeah. I love the analogy you use in the book around the fact that leadership is like tending to a garden. Can I ask what you mean by that to
Yeah.
explain to the
So
listeners?
I want to be very clear. That's borrowed from Stan McChrystal. So General McChrystal, who wrote the outstanding book Teams of Teams. So when he was commanding the task force in the Middle East, he realized that they had everything. The Allied forces, better equipment, more man and woman power, better technology, and yet they were losing against Al Qaeda. So he had the humility to recognize that he needed to change the way he led his task force from, as he put it, leading like a chess master, top controlling his pawns on the chessboard, to leading like a gardener. And so, what does that? And by the way, I often talk about this. In the UK, it's gardening. In this
Yeah.
country, it's yard work, right?
Okay.
So, but that's a quick aside. So, as a gardener, we can't actually make our flowers grow, right? We can't. Much like in our teams, we can't actually make our people do stuff. But what we can and what we must do when we lead like a gardener is humbly provide the right environment, watering, weeding, keeping pests out, or in our organizations, the right cultural environment so that our plants, our people can flourish. So it's this shift from, top-down command control, do as I tell you because I tell you, to I create the right environment, the right culture so that our people can flourish. And, McChrystal is one of the first prominent military leaders embracing, he didn't call it humble leadership, but it really is humble leadership. And the task force, because of the changes he implemented, leading like a gardener, became 17 times more effective because of that change of approach.
Yeah. I really got it when I was reading that. And I think, like you say, just stop trying to micromanage everything, step back, loosen your grip. And, if you nurture things right, then you'll be able to sit back and watch your team and your organization grow. This podcast is sponsored by B2B Frameworks, and your book leans heavily on different frameworks to guide the reader towards this path of becoming the badass leader, whilst also being a good human, of course. There are two specific frameworks that form the bedrock of the book. But firstly, I want to just laser in on the humble leadership framework. Can you explore more in terms of what is this framework and what are these the three defining dimensions of the framework?
Yeah, so it's, a three-legged stool, and then the five shifts you mentioned sort of overlaid those three legs. So the three legs of the stool are, first of all, deep self-awareness. So seeing myself in line with our others see us. And when we think, when people think about humble leadership, that often comes to mind as the first thing. Like, I see myself accurately. And by the way, doesn't mean I, I put myself down at all. Like, it's an accurate view of myself.
Yeah.
And, there's a notion in there around, I have to have the humility that I can't achieve everything, but I can achieve almost anything when I put my mind to it. So around focus as well. So self-awareness is the first one. The second one is leading relationally on a team level. So building, in a nutshell, meaningful collaborative relationships with my people, seeing them as human beings versus just, cogs in the wheel that get stuff done for me. And then leading relationally on an organizational level. So that goes into Amy Edmondson's work around building a psychologically safe culture. All too often, the advice we receive on how to become a great leader focuses on individual leadership excellence, vision, passion, follow through. But to truly lead relationally, organizationally, we need to take responsibility for the interpersonal skills, for the interpersonal dynamics, how our people interact. Like, that's our responsibility, actually, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So providing the culture, and then undergirding those three legs of the stool is, the famous growth mindset, right? So seeing mistakes and failures as an opportunity for learning and growing versus something to be, ashamed of, or worse, even sweep under the carpet.
Yeah, and I think to Amy's book, that growth mindset piece, and like you say, reframing failure as this important growth opportunity is so important. We shouldn't feel ashamed, or even worse, trying to cover up those mistakes. We should embrace it,
Yeah.
and take learnings from it.
And it's hard. I mean, we're deeply loss averse as human beings, right? Nobody likes to fail. Like, and many of us, it's very hard to argue with our feelings. But then the question is, do we remain in that frame of being, feeling ashamed, feeling embarrassed, or are we, as you say, able to reframe and then learn from the experience?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so that's the humble leadership framework. But as you say, that then supports this 5-shift framework and helps the leader transform into a humble leader. So the framework has 5 stages or shifts to it, and I'd like to go through each in turn if we could. So starting with dig deep, what is this stage and how does it align with the humble leadership framework?
So that's basically dig deep is the first leg of the stool. So that's the deep self-awareness. So, all the research out there across the board, peer-reviewed, shows that deeply self-aware leaders, build better relationships, make better decisions, get promoted faster, their companies and teams are more profitable. So that's the self-awareness piece. And in terms of what to do about it, we are all familiar with the 360s, or it's as simple as regularly asking for feedback in our one-on-ones on what do I do well as your leader, Nick, and what can I do better, right?
Yeah,
And so, I have a lot of very tangible and, tactical and actionable sort of exercises and things people can do to actually become more self-aware. So there's the seeing myself in line with how others see us. And then there's this notion of focus. I have an athletic background. And so athletes are amazing at ruthlessly focus on what's most important and being able to say no to anything that distracts. So, and, in business, we're notoriously guilty of just taking on more, and not holding stop doing meetings. I even challenge my clients, have a stop doing meeting once a quarter. What do we need to kill? So that's the focus piece. And then in that self-awareness or dig deep shift, I also talk about what we just talked earlier around the notion of failing successfully. So I talk about, one of my biggest athletic failures that almost cost me my life. And I was flooded during an ultra race. I was flooded with horrific shame and guilt and embarrassment. And it took me a long time to reframe and then learn from that experience. So that's the dig deep shift.
yeah, and I think again that's why I love sport. I'm an avid sportsman, love all sports, and so hearing that story and tying that into the overarching story, I again could totally relate to in having that focus, really being able to say what I am going to do and what I'm not going to do, and to your point, there's lots of different exercises, and to those that are watching or those listeners. There's lots of different, and at the end of each chapter, there's lots of different QR codes that you can click on. I took the radical humility test in your book, and I achieved a score of 86 out of 100. So I was pretty pleased with that.
Yes.
It showed I've not reached mastery levels just yet, but I'm at advanced radical humility. What I really like is that it broke it down to show where I scored highest and where I need to work on. And I scored highest, I think, on the growth mindset, but lowest actually on this dig deep particular part of the framework. So I need to do more with my self-awareness and understand what really matters to me moving forward. But it's actionable, therefore, and good fun along the way as you're reading the book. B2B Frameworks is a curated collection of proven business frameworks to develop your strategic thinking skills, solve your biggest business problems, and unlock your next promotion. Our mission is to help you achieve these goals. We want to create the next generation of successful business leaders by providing the tools and frameworks needed to create effective strategies that drive business growth. Each framework comes with a downloadable set of instructions with large, colourful diagrams and editable templates to guide you through the process step by step and prompt you to consider the problem from every possible angle. Along with audio guides and educational tools, our extensive content library is full of real-world examples and case studies of strategic thinking in action. So why learn with B2B Frameworks? We've carefully curated only the most effective, proven business and marketing frameworks. Our downloadable materials and audio guides will help you easily apply each framework. And the insights and advice you'll find across the site are based on 30 years of consulting experience from one of the world's leading business strategy experts, Paul Haig. B2B Frameworks is a small investment to advance your career or grow your business. Start your journey to becoming a successful business leader by joining B2B Frameworks today. The next 3 shifts are called tough on results, tender on people, lead like a compass, and full transparency. And these are all relate to what you talked about, the leading relationally with your team. Can you talk through these shifts and use any examples you may have to emphasize these different stages of the journey?
Absolutely. So tough on results, tender on people. The notion is build trusting and meaningful relationships with my people while at the same time holding them to the highest level, right? So I have an example in the book. The best commander I've ever had, this was in Kosovo, opened a meeting we had with these words. He said, "Urs, I love you. And this is not even close to being good enough." So I love you. He cared for me personally. And people are often surprised. We use that word, that expression, "I love you" a lot in the military, actually. It's very close bonds. And then he delivered the message why it wasn't good enough. If he would have yelled at me, if he would have belittled me, I would have tuned him out. I would have not been able to actually take his feedback on board, but it made me shrink in my chair. And I turned myself inside out for the next 9 months to only deliver the best work. So it's the notion that I can build meaningful and trusting relationships with my people while at the same time coming back to the earlier point of you not being an emotional doormat, holding them to the highest level, highest standards. So, the notion that we either have to be a good human or a tough leader is a false dichotomy. Like, we truly can build meaningful and trusting relationships with our people and still do hard stuff in a human way. Yes. So that's the first one. And then the second one is the notion of leading like a compass. And this is, I know there's a lot of buzzwords in here, but this is really all about delegating as deep down into the organization as possible and empowering as much as I can through what I call shared purpose. And, a great example here is Hubert Joly. He writes about his turnaround of Best Buy in his outstanding book, The Heart of Business, which I think had just its 3-year anniversary of publication actually this week. And so he actually started his turnaround tenure at Best Buy working on the floor of a Best Buy store with a name tag that read CEO in training. Yeah. I just dig that. So he understood that humbly learning from the front lines, actually doing his blue shirts, jobs, would best inform him on how to turn the ship around. And then he arrived at shared purpose, which was literally, let's stop doing anything that's stupid, goofy, or crazy. Instead of a grand strategy, the first principles needed to get fixed. And then over time, as the less stupid stuff happened, he changed the shared purpose to service like the Geek Squad, which is still today. And he talks about this notion, which is so uncomfortable for many of us, that when he almost felt he lost control of the operation because he pushed decision-making so deep into the organization, that's when performance skyrocketed. So that's this notion of lead like a compass. And, I get often pushback, my business is too small, I can't do it. No, even in a small team, the true test of my leadership is how the ship runs when I'm not there. Yeah. How can I make myself obsolete? How can I work myself out of a job? So that's the second one. And then
on that point, Urs, I think if you're in a small business, you're at the coalface, aren't you? So you're seeing everything firsthand. You're seeing what's good, what's bad. You're working with your colleagues, so you should have that opportunity to do different things and to change things easier than in a big corporate.
Yeah. And then where were we? We were at the full transparency. Yeah, exactly. So the third pillar of I should remember my own framework, should I not? So the third pillar is lead with full transparency. There's really 2 elements to that. The first one is sharing, and this is almost a no-brainer, really sharing much more about our business decisions, our thinking, our rationale as leaders. Like, as I'm sure, we can't over communicate that. Yeah. And so this is, and having honest and open conversations so that the best idea wins, not necessarily your idea or my idea. So full transparency around our strategy, our rationale, our decision making, our thinking. And then the other aspect of this transparency piece is actually owning my shortcomings as a leader with appropriate vulnerability. And, demonstrating to our teams that we too are work in progress. And there's plenty of research on the value of vulnerability to build trust. It is the quickest way to build trust. Brené Brown famously said, vulnerability is the last thing I want to show you, but it's the first thing I'm looking for in you, right? Yeah. So everybody admires perfection from a distance. Nobody can relate to it. So it's being transparent around both what's going on in our business and the direction we're going, and also transparent around my own work in progress aspects as a leader.
Yeah. No, I absolutely get that, and I think again going back to my old self, running a global agency, and we've talked about it. I never profess to know everything, but in terms of building trust, you've got to show that you have some form of vulnerability. We know we're not super people, and we're always striving to get better. So making sure that people know that. And demonstrating that we are this work in progress, as you say, is so important. Finally, it's shift 5, and it's called Champion a Fearless Culture, and this relates to leading relationally with your organization. So building on that relationally with your team and putting that into it as an organization. Can you talk about what it takes to create a fearless culture? Because it's not easy, that's for sure, is it?
No, it's not. So I have a framework in there, sort of a 4-step framework. And, to be totally clear, based on a lot of giants, including Amy Edmondson, who, came before me, who researched psychological safety deeply. So the first piece is really reframing failure for our team members. So I think Amy, in her new book, talks about this United pilot who opens every crew meeting at the beginning of a flight with these words. He said, "I've never done a perfect flight before, and I will prove it to you again today. So I need your help. I need you to speak up when you see me do something wrong, and I'll do the same for you." That's reframing. That means the pilot knows there'll never be a perfect flight. There'll never be a perfect podcast, a perfect client pitch, there won't.
Yeah.
So I need to make it safe for everybody to say something when they see something. So I will often ask my leaders, so when's the last time you had a conversation with your team of how we treat failures and mistakes in our teams? And so, reframing failure, if we only want to hear about the good stuff, they'll still happen, the failures. They'll simply go on the ground.
Yeah.
And so, and by the way, reframing failure does not mean I have low performance standards. I can shoot for the stars, have the most ambitious goals, and still reframe failure. So that's the first one. The second one is, encouraging speaking up. How does this look? This is powerful questions, open-ended questions, and active listening. And it's so simple. All this stuff, it's so simple, but it's not easy. How are we listening? Are we listening to respond, or are we truly listening to understand where the other person comes from? And then the third one is acknowledging and thanking. So our first response when people bring a point up in a team meeting always needs to be, "Thank you for bringing this up." It doesn't mean that I agree. It doesn't mean that I'm doing something about it. Leadership, as you and I know, is not a popularity contest, but we always ask, we always thank, we always listen, and then we get to decide what to do with it. And then the fourth piece in this, shifting towards a fearless, psychologically safe culture is this notion of experientially learning together, taking our team out of the, regular office environment and doing something where we have to show up with vulnerability. I mean, I know I talk a lot about the experience I had in my peacekeeping missions, hostage training. That's very unpleasant. It's humiliating. They strip you down, they tie you, and you don't know what's going on, and they yell at you and all that. And so I underwent many of these trainings, for better or worse, with my teams. And we always grew as a team because we experienced each other vulnerable. We had to rely on whoever was able to take the lead, regardless of rank. And we really grew as a team. Now, of course, we can't do hostage training. HR won't be happy with that. But there's other ways. I mean, simple things like cooking and eating together. It's so simple, but that really builds a team where people feel safe to speak up and everybody brings their whole self to the team. So that's the fourth step of shifting our teams towards a fearless culture, psychologically safe culture.
And for all those that are viewing on the YouTube channel, you can see behind me, we've got Urs's perfect book that we're talking about here. We've also got Amy's book. It's got a different cover, actually, over here in Europe.
That's right, it does.
But they're two fabulous books, and they go hand in hand in terms of, what we're talking about here today. I think, in terms of our listeners and our viewers, everyone wants something quickly these days, whether you're from a small or mid-sized organization through to a large multinational corporates. And I realize there is no immediate shortcut. I mean, the first step is to buy the book, of course. But do you have any top tips that leaders can take in order to start to move in the right direction around radical humility, to embrace that?
2 words, Nick. Just ask. Just ask. So just ask goes with just ask your team members for feedback. Yeah. How am I doing as your leader? At the end of every one-on-one, I said that earlier. Just ask. And then also just ask your team members around, getting to know them on a more personal level, or their career aspirations. Like, where do you want to be? I need to really, as a leader, understand everyone on my team. Where do they want to go? What are their career aspirations? What's going on in their personal lives? Culturally appropriate, of course. It varies from context to context. So just ask is my quick response to that.
And pre-COVID, I used to live on and off aeroplanes and cars and train journeys, traveling with my colleagues both to pitch and to present work. And it was such a valuable time because you're spending quality time with them. You're understanding who they are, just getting to know them as human beings. And I think this digital age that we've now, pivoted to is you don't get that. So I think I love that just ask, because, when we are only in the office 1 or 2 days a week, then, sometimes we can lose that connection between our colleagues. So make sure that we get to know them inside out. And it builds relationships that you can then build upon.
Exactly right. Traveling together, it's perfect. Yes.
Yeah. So we've talked about the humble leadership framework. We've also talked about the 5 shifts framework, and there's other frameworks in the book as well. Thinking through all the different business frameworks that have been created throughout time, and thinking back to your consultancy line of work as well. Do you have a favorite business framework that you look to lean on, and why is it a favorite of yours?
So I'm going to break the rule here, make it super quick. So I'm not a strategy guy, but I still love Porter's 5 Forces. I think published in 1979 in HBR, whatever. It's just so elegant. So I love that. But sort of more related to my work, I like the very simple Eisenhower matrix, that Stephen Covey made it, of course, popular, the important versus urgent.
Yeah.
And then the Johari window. Right, the blind spots, and that was created in 1955. Actually, people are always surprised by that. So those would be some of the favorites I have.
Yeah, and if they stand the test of time, then they're good frameworks. Right. Keeping it simple as well. I do like the 2x2, and so important versus urgent, and how to take action on the back of that. I often used to use those in the many workshops run. To conclude, just a few questions I ask all my guests. So
yes.
To start with, we've been talking about your book. But what are you reading personally at the moment?
I've been challenged a few times on podcasts around this notion of vulnerability. It's more difficult as a female executive. It's more different as an African-American executive. So I'm actually I haven't started, to be honest. Why do so many incompetent men become leaders and how to fix it. So
Right.
I'm going to start this
I've not
this
heard
week.
of that job title, but it sounds interesting.
Yeah, this weekend. And then I referred to Brené Brown. So she co-wrote with Tarana Burke, "You Are the Best Thing: Vulnerability, Shame, Resilience, and the Black Experience." So because I've been challenged on some of my thinking, I picked up those 2 books. I'm going to start reading those actually this weekend.
Yeah, well, she comes up many times in terms
Of
of
course.
people from a book perspective, but also from podcasts as well.
Yeah.
What's the best business book that you'd recommend our listeners to read? Do you have any there?
It's not a business book, but read South by Shackleton.
Right.
Shackleton, the Irish polar explorer Shackleton, actually deployed radically humble leadership almost 110 years ago during his, to this day, #1 survival story ever. So I would recommend South by Shackleton, and then of course, Endurance by Lansing. So it's not a business book, I realize, but it exemplifies humble leadership 110 years ago, and I love that.
Yeah, well, do you know what? I've never read either of those, but I love those type of books, and especially underpinned around exploring as well. So I will look those up. What's the best piece of business advice you've ever been given?
Any business is a people business. Yeah,
Absolutely.
any business is people, and and that's I've also been told, and I agree, and I sometimes say this to myself: you want to be a leader, you need to fundamentally love people. It doesn't mean you need to be an extrovert. It really doesn't. But you fundamentally need to enjoy people. So those
Good
2.
advice, definitely. I vouch for that too, as well.
Right.
Sometimes it's the most painful bit of running a business, maybe, but you definitely get the most rewards as well if you work at it. Back to that gardener analogy.
Right. What was the joke? If it weren't for the damn customers and the bloody team members, it'd be so easy to run a business, right?
Yeah, yeah. In fact, your podcast is going out next week, and then following that is a podcast with Michael Bungay Stanier, and that's all about how to work with almost anyone, and so there's lots of learnings that come from that, and so I recommend people to stay tuned for that one too. I've got to ask this question because, again, relating to the book itself. But who would you say is a badass leader, a business leader that you most admire for embracing radical humility?
Satya Nadella at Microsoft, CEO of
Yeah,
Microsoft. I mean, he truly turned Microsoft, as we all know, not just around financially, but in terms of its culture, from the Steve Ballmer sort of area, based on his own values. Curiosity, constant learning, and growth mindset is an integral part of, you probably know this, of the curriculum at Microsoft, actually, the leadership development curriculum, and humility. So, he would be an amazing, or is an amazing example of what I write about in the book.
yeah. And in fact, he's probably come up in around half of the podcasts I've talked about. So what he does and what he did, sorry, at Microsoft was such a big feat. Then it's really left an impression on the business world.
Well, I hate to be so mainstream and say what everybody else thinks, but it really is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, who would you like me to reach out to and invite to come on this podcast in the future?
So I have 2 people in mind, actually. Peter Shine, who's the son of Ed Shine, who recently passed away. And Ed Shine, of course, is one of the fathers of OD, and they co-wrote the book Humble Leadership, and just came out with a second edition. So he would be amazing. And then a colleague of mine, who you probably don't know, Ashish Advani. He's the CEO of Junior Achievements.
Okay.
And he just is publishing a book later this year together with Marshall Goldsmith about modern achievement. So how have we, or do we need to change our thinking about what achievement means? So Peter Shine and Ashish Advani, I think, would be amazing on your podcast, Nick.
Well, that's great. I might get you to make those.
Absolutely. Happy to make an introduction.
Yeah, fabulous. But yeah, Peter and Ashish, I'd love to have them on the show as well. Well, Urs, I cannot recommend this book highly enough. What you've done is turn one of the most, I think, misunderstood character traits into this leadership superpower. I definitely find this book as a Bible. It's got this step-by-step framework, useful toolkits, exercises, that you can get. We've already talked about scanning the QR codes in each chapter. But if you do follow this, then you, the listener, can lead your company along this path of prosperity and create this not only this healthy culture of positivity and empowerment, but you can build your business along the way too. So first step after listening to this is you have to go out and buy the book, Radical Humility. But if people do have any questions, how should they get in touch with you, Urs?
Find me on the web at urskoenig.com. I'm very active on LinkedIn, a little bit less on Instagram. I'd love to chat with readers around their experience, what they're running up against and what works, what doesn't work. And, I do a fair amount of speaking. So if it would be helpful to come in and do a workshop or a speech, I would love to do that too. But I really enjoy, since the book came out, on a one-on-one basis, interacting with people about their experiences, and sometimes even hopping on a quick Zoom call. So I'd love to do that.
Yeah, get in touch. Well, I need to thank you, Urs, for joining me today. You're speaking from the West Coast in Seattle, so it's early morning there. So I'll allow you to go and get another cup of coffee. But it really has been inspirational. And reading the book, thoroughly enjoyed. So thanks again for writing the book and for sparing us some time on the podcast today.
Absolutely, I loved it. It was so much fun. Thanks for having me, Nick.
Thanks, Urs.